Hello and welcome to the War Room. This is the state of the world at the end of the last session. The US declared war on the UK in order to release both Rupert's Land and Australia. Japan came to the UK's defense, and eventually Scandinavia joined on the US's side, and Austria-Hungary and I eventually joined the USA side as well. Russia is allied with Japan, which means that if any war goals are added on Japan, which seemed to be what Scandinavia wanted to do, Russia might be joining in defense of Japan. There's a possibility that if things don't go well, France might be joining our side, but since it's now between sessions, France could just as easily join the UK side. And if there were a situation where France, Spain, and Russia all join the UK side, then me and Austria would be unable to hold against them, and then we would lose. Of course, there are no tickers, so we need occupations, we need battles, we got plus 50 from battles, but really it's anyone's game at this point. Now, my goal from the start of the game was to win the colonial game, and I did pretty well, but I wouldn't say I won the colonial game. I do have colonies all over the place, but clearly the UK still has more and better colonies than I do. But my hope was that by winning this war, and since my joining made it a great war, would have been able to carve out some of British Africa. But unfortunately, we're never going to know how this war would have ended up because this was the last session. And this is actually the topic of the video, the last session problem. Now, the last session problem is rooted in the fact that Victoria 2 unmodded runs for a finite amount of time. You have until 1936 to do whatever you need to get done, and at that point the game ends. So, if you happen to make it that far, what it means is that the closer you get to 1936, the more your strategy revolves around the fact that the game is ending. Which means that that big war you've been putting off and waiting for, you can't put off anymore. Or that big crazy thing you were planning to do for several sessions, well, this is your last chance to do it, so either you do it now or you never do it. Or if you just feel like memeing it up, then you can ruin your country, and this is the one acceptable time to ruin your country because it's the end of the game anyway. So that's what happens in 1936, but this applies to any point where the game might potentially come to an end. And this is where the last session problem comes in. So as an example, if you know that the game is going to end in 1880, then things are going to start going apeshit in 1870, while people try and rush to beat the clock and do whatever they need to do in time for the game to end in 1880. Now, is this necessarily a problem? No, not really. And I mean, if you started out the campaign with the intention of only going to 1880, then it's understandable. The problem is, games don't start out with the intention of going to 1880. They don't start out with the intention of going to 1915, or 1922 for that matter. They start out with the intention of going to 1936, or at least until there's some consensus that a new campaign needs to be started. The problem comes from two things. Number one, it's a session-based game, and there's only so much time you can get through in a given session. Even if you have no rehosts, no crashes, and everything goes perfectly, if you have a 3-hour hard time limit, there's only so much time you can get through. The second issue is that not everyone is going to agree that a campaign needs to end. But once people decide that a campaign needs to end, all the same shit happens. At best, people do things that are crazy and illogical, and at worst, they ruin their nations. Let's take a look at an example here. Since this was the last session, Netherlands decided to release every single nation it possibly could. He also, at the end of the session, declared a meme war against Liechtenstein, which went nowhere, obviously, but, you know, he wouldn't have done that if it weren't the last session. This is the kind of shit that I'm talking about. So even if the rest of us did want to continue, with 14 years theoretically left in the game, the Netherlands is fucked, and him being fucked is going to have impact on all the rest of us. The same thing happened in the last campaign. I think it was, Aden was playing Italy or something? He basically rage quit and in the process ruined his nation. That's why we had to restart. And just to be clear, this is different from an example where someone either intentionally or unintentionally ruins their nation, and then as a result of that, the campaign is restarted. What I'm talking about here is people specifically ruining their nations because they think the campaign is going to end. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we cannot continue because you've ruined your nation. This is exactly what's happened now with the Netherlands, and it's what happened last session. I think Aden was playing Italy or something. So we were pretty early in the last game. That's when I was playing Brazil. Things were finally getting interesting in the Americas. A handful of Europeans decided that the game was over, and as a result, they fucked it for everyone. This is the last session problem. They decided it was the last session, and then rather than seeing if it actually needed to be the last session, they ensured it would be the last session because they fucked everything in the process. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's the most aggravating thing in the game for me. Let's take a look at earlier in this campaign as a good example. So Austria and I were allied, right? We had Russia as an ally at various times, you know, a little bit here and there he was against us, but basically we had the three of us in a block. We weren't fighting each other. And most of the rest of the world just assumed that we were going to win the game. And because of that, there were people on this other side that wanted to quit the campaign. They were like, oh, you already won. Let's just restart. Did I win? No. Did I think I was going to win? No. I certainly don't think I did a bad job, but I wouldn't say I won the campaign. The fact that we continued past that point is what made the campaign more interesting. So it didn't turn out like they predicted. Everything they predicted just didn't happen. And the way that they dealt with the situation made things interesting. I mean, we had a situation earlier in the game. It was Germany, Austria-Hungary, Netherlands, Scandinavia versus France, Spain, United Kingdom, Russia, fucking Japan, and the United States. Basically 80% of the world against this tiny little bit of Europe right here, okay? And, also Italy on their side for whatever that counts. But basically, we would have just been completely fucked, right? That's a situation where a lot of players would just say, okay, we give up, you win, let's start a new campaign. But we didn't do that. You know why we didn't do that? Because we got past it. We got through it. We dealt with it. And even if we'd have lost, we'd have still tried to deal with it, and it would have been interesting. And hey, it worked out for us. Maybe we would have gotten our asses handed to us. But hey, you know, at least we would have tried, right? But the fact is, we didn't go into that session after that mega alliance appeared. We didn't go into that session saying, okay, well, we'll fight you once, and then after we fight you, this is the last session, that's the end of the game. Why would that need to be the end of the game? That's arbitrary as fuck. I mean, depending on who wins, it's very much not the end of the game. But this is the sort of thing you have to take into consideration. It's like, you have your idea of what might happen, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't happen, but whether it happens or not doesn't mean the game comes to an end. And that's the same fucking situation we find ourselves in. And it's the same thing that's been happening for the last 3 sessions. Each of these last 3 sessions has been the last session. And you know what? 2 of those last 3 sessions weren't actually the last session, because we just kept on going. And why did we keep going? It's because me and other people were saying that, hey, we still want to play this. You know why? Because it's a fucking interesting game. It doesn't matter if you can't win. Most of the nations in the game can't win. And, you know, winning depends on your definition of winning. For some people, winning is getting that #1 score. For me, winning is accomplishing whatever your goals are. Did I accomplish my goals? I mean, I got pretty far along the way, I guess, but I didn't fully accomplish everything I wanted. But hey, it was a good game. Whether the UK or the USA comes out as the #1 nation, at this point doesn't matter, because it's a question of what can I do from this point to do as well as I possibly can as the German Empire. And the same applies to any nation, you know. As Spain, are you trying to become #1 in the world? It's very unlikely, but, you know, what can you do as Spain? There are some nations that can possibly rise to #1, and there are a ton of nations that can't. So if you're playing one of those nations, you just have to do the best you can, and then, you know, be happy with the result, because did you do as good as you could? Did it work out? Did it not work out? You know, that's what makes a game interesting. It's not all about getting that #1 spot. And hey, I was #1 for a while, and I'm not #1 anymore. But I wouldn't say I'm worse off than I was then, even though I'm lower rank now. So let's go back to the last session thing. Whenever people decide that whatever in their mind has already come to pass, and nothing is going to change, then they declare it's the last session. And then one of 2 things happens. Either it's not the last session because things didn't go according to what you planned, and, you know, the game is actually still interesting, as it usually is, or people just ruin their nations because they want it to end, and then it's actually the last session because you made it the last session, because you made sure it was the last session. Again, let's break this down a bit more. If you're saying this next upcoming session, whenever that happens to be, is the last session, what you're saying is that either the current status quo is not going to change, and so there's no point playing past it, or that whatever happens in the next session is going to be so one-sided that there's no possible way anyone could recover, and the status quo is not going to change after that session. There are some major flaws in that thinking, and let's look at the previous session to see why that's the case. UK came into this session expecting to be destroyed, so as far as he was concerned, the game was over. And it's just a question of how much land are people going to take from him, and then he's done, right? So he wanted it to be the last session, because why would he continue wanting to play if people are just going to keep ripping land away from him, right? The USA came into this session with the assumption that I'm going to rip the UK new asshole, and I'm going to keep taking land from him, and then I'm going to win the game, and then there's no point in anyone else playing, right? Well, guess what? The UK and the USA aren't the only 2 nations in the fucking game. We got lots of other nations that have things that they can do that don't rely on the UK or the USA. And the thing that the UK expected to happen actually didn't happen. His expectation was that all of the world was going to coalition him just like we'd coalitioned the US in the previous session, and that he was going to get completely ripped apart. But guess what? That didn't happen. The US declared war for his cores. He got his cores. That was one war. No one else is involved in that. But that didn't change the fact that it was already declared the last session, just like the two before it, right? Okay, so that was completely wrong. Let's look what else happened. So there was a minor war between Japan versus USA and Spain, not too important, but the next big war is USA trying to liberate both Rupert's Land and Australia. And obviously this is going to happen. I mean, the USA's been pretty vocal that this has been his plan, right? But again, what didn't happen is all of Europe and everyone else in the game didn't join this mega coalition against the UK, even though, you know, maybe we could have. What happened instead is Japan joined on the UK side. So why did Japan join the UK side? I honestly don't know. But I'm glad he did because it's something interesting that happened. So this is where all the other nations in the world come in, because the game isn't just about the goddamn UK and USA. Well, for my part, I'm looking for colonies, and if the USA's at war with the UK, and it looks like he's going to probably win anyway, then why don't I hop into this and help him out, and also get some land for myself? Hey, you know what? Austria wants his penis back, so obviously he wants that land too. But hey, we got Russia over here, and that's a different consideration, because he's allied to both me and Austria, and Japan. So we've got some actual diplomacy taking place here. We got France over here that's sort of a wild card. We got Spain over here. And you know, there's all these different nations with their own different motivations. And they're not concerned with, am I the #1 nation in the game? They're just concerned with, what am I going to do to make my nation as good as it can possibly be? And what can I do in the current situation? It's either going to make the most sense or be the most fun depending on your play style. So what I'm saying is we had this really interesting situation. And this situation is independent of the fact that it was already deemed the last session. But because it's the last session, the game's now over. So not only is it unresolved, but it's a really interesting situation that's unresolved. As I said before, the 2 sessions before this previous session were also the last session. But as we saw, that didn't actually happen. They weren't the last session because we kept going. And we could have kept going after this one too, except now we got people ruining their nation, so we really can't. So this is sort of a general fuck you to anyone who ruins their nation because they specifically want the game to end. That's a really fucking selfish thing to do. I mean, even if you rage quit, someone can still take over that nation and continue, even if you're not there. But once you just fuck up your nation, there's nothing left to take over. There's no way to fix it. So, you know, if that's what you do, then you're just ruining the game for everyone else. And that's not directed against any one person, because this is something that a lot of people do in a lot of different campaigns when they come to an end. So just keep that in mind. Don't be the asshole that ruins the game for everyone else. Final thoughts. If everyone agrees that it's time to end the campaign, sure, end the campaign. And you know, there have been times in the Friday casual groups where we've stopped a campaign in the middle of the fucking session. We'll get like an hour or two into it and we decide, hey, you know what? This campaign's basically done. Let's start a new one. So that's exactly what we do. In the middle of the fucking session, we'll just stop and start a new campaign right there on the spot. And you know what? That makes a lot of sense, because when you're in the game, you get a feel for it, and you know, okay, this is not going to change. We basically have got the status quo, and let's start a new campaign. Okay, that makes sense. What we don't do is go into a session saying, this is going to be the last session, so everyone go apeshit, and then even if it doesn't end up going crazy, we're not going to continue because we've already declared it's the last session. That makes no sense at all. If it's between sessions and you're taking polls and people decide it's time to end the campaign, you know, I might not agree, but I can understand that, right? Everyone's had time to think about it, and at least they're all on the same page. And, you know, as a group, we can decide, okay, let's continue or let's not continue. What doesn't make any sense at all is declaring that the campaign is going to end after 3 or 4 additional hours of playing that are going to change the state of the world and maybe make the game a lot more interesting than it is right now, because right now is the situation that you're using to decide that the campaign is going to end in 3 or 4 hours. It makes no fucking sense. Don't do it. Don't do it. Please stop ruining campaigns like this. It's the most frustrating thing in a multiplayer game. If you're going to end it after the fact, not before the fact. So obviously this campaign's over. No idea what would have happened. The new Sunday campaign starts on the 9th. I'm not going to be here, so I will be missing the first session. And I'll be here for the second session, picking up as I don't know who. Basically, any nation that's open, I'm just going to hop on it and start playing. So it'll probably be some little shit nation like Greece or something. Maybe in South America again. But anyway, it doesn't really matter because it's going to be a while. So for now, it's just Friday campaigns. Might try and work on some other videos in the meantime, but I'm also busy with some other stuff. So thanks for watching. Stop ruining campaigns.